you magic makers out there, and welcome to Touch of Magic, where we explore everything magical, mystical, mysterious, and metaphysical. I'm your host, Marissa DiAradia, aka Sin City Witch, and today we have with us Sir Terrence Williams, and we're going to be discussing Thelema, the O.T.O. Sir Terrence Williams has spent most of his adult life in pursuit of the great work. Having accepted the Law of Thelema in the early 1900s, he eventually pursued formal initiation into the Ordo Templi Orientis, or Order of the Eastern Templars, in 1994. He also served as an officer in local O.T.O organizations for many years and a master of the Serpentine Splendour Lodge from 2001 to 2006. His efforts, along with a small number of other adherents in Las Vegas, were instrumental in the development of the local Southern Nevada Thelemic Community. He was ordained into the Ecclesia Gnostica Catholica, that's the Gnostic Catholic Church, which is the religious arm of the O.T.O. He became a priest in 1998, and he studied the Occult, Thelema, the Qabalah, Tarot, Hermeticism. He's a writer, and at this time, he's an aspirant of the Ordo A A. And we're going to find out what that is during our talk for those of us who don't know, me being one of them. He currently works at a law firm in Henderson. He's partners in WindPixie Pictures, and he's also written several independent documentary films. Okay, so I don't know who else is thoroughly impressed, but I certainly am. So welcome, and thank you for being with us today. I'm so excited to talk about this.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So you've got so much knowledge and experience on this fascinating subject. And there's a lot of people out there who don't know a lot about any type of ceremonial magic. And especially when you say Thelema or the O.T.O, some people have a lot of misconceptions. And I'm hoping we can clear that up today. So the first thing I want to ask you, so that you can educate our audience for anybody who doesn't know, is what is Thelema? What is it?
Okay, Thelema is a philosophical / religious / magical system of belief that originated in 1904 after the reception of the Book of the Law by Aleister Crowley, who would later on become kind of the prophet, the prophet of the Thelemic movement. Thelema means will in the Greek language. Okay, Thelema also, if you add up the numbers, which letters in Greek and Hebrew and other languages equal numbers. So if you add up the numbers that equal Thelema, it comes out to be 93. Hence, that's why you see 93 oftentimes used as a shortened kind of greeting between Thelemites. So the greeting normally is "do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law," and the corollary is "love is the law, love under will." And both of those, Thelema, agape, both of them equal 93. Anyway, but this belief system originated in 1904 when Crowley, while he was on a honeymoon with his wife Rose Kelly, received the Book of the Law as a document, apparently recited to him in over 3 days in April in Egypt by his holy guardian angel. Now, that's the story. Okay, that's the origin story. The absoluteness of how exactly all of that happened, we only have the written account in his biography. But we do have the Book of the Law, which is, in my opinion, more important. The Book of the Law is a document, received text, like a holy book, if you will, that heralds the new aeon of Thelema, the aeon of the law of "do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law." This gets us out of what Crowley referred to as the Osirian era, or the old era, which is when you had the Father God, the dying God, the Christian era dominant. So now we're in the era no longer of the Father, no longer of the Mother before that one. Now we're in the aeon of the child, which all sounds very abstract and weird, but essentially it's an individualist magical system. It's based on the individual being who they are and figuring out their will and doing it. So this belief system slowly but surely percolated in magical and occult circles, and later on, over the decades, had a lot of influence all over the place. In particular, with its fusion of East and Western disciplines, right? Like, so we've got a lot of yoga, and we've got a lot of Qabalah, and we've got a lot of Western Hermetics. We've got a lot of different things, all kind of complementing each other within Thelema. And like I said, the cultural impact you see later on in, say from the 1960s onwards, when Crowley kind of became the countercultural icon for a while, and later on in the 70s and 80s, he became kind of a poster boy for a sort of rebellious Satanist kind of attitude out there. But in any case, this kind of mystical occult system was very influential, not just within its own community, but through, all over the place in culture. Crowley was such an influential occultist, given how many people he worked with and so forth and so on. Basically, the reason why we still have New Age groups and initiating orders and people do this stuff on their own and so forth and so on largely comes from the influence of Sir Aleister Crowley, believe it or not. And so Thelema is the name of the belief system that he founded, that later on other people began to work with. Now, this system includes magical orders. That was the thing to do back in the 19th, early 20th century. You had a magical order. You had initiating orders. There are three main orders that we think of with regards to Thelema. There is the O.T.O, which is an initiatory body, very, very similar to Freemasonry. And that's the order that has gone away and come back and had a bit of a revival the last couple of decades and controls the publishing and so forth and so on. Then you have the Gnostic Catholic Church, which is the religious arm of the O.T.O. And they do public rituals like the Gnostic Mass. Then you have the AA, which may or may not stand for anything, but basically that's the magical order. And that's where you do solitary work, basically under an instructor to achieve the knowledge and conversation of your holy guardian angel and crossing the abyss, meaning the great work itself. So you've got, and if you notice, these orders do different things. So the O.T.O, it creates, if you will, a Thelemic society, right? The community. The church, takes care of the spiritual needs of that community of initiates in the O.T.O. And then the initiatory path, the personal path of the great work is accomplished by through the AA. Not everybody's going to do these things any more than everyone's going to initiate into, Gardnerian Wicca or whatever. People are going to do what, they're going to be into as part of the Thelemic movement, but there's a lot. It's because it's got a large body of literature and a large body of initiated interests and people working with different parts of it. If you go online, you might have already run into this. There's all kinds of websites out there for Thelemites, not just, oh, we're so evil, but people trading information and that kind of thing. And like I said, I kind of got into this during the 90s period when it really had this new blossoming of interest that has continued on for the last couple of decades.
Okay, so yeah, you touched on how actually Thelema has touched a lot of different practices. I have heard that Crowley was responsible for part of the Book of Shadows for Gardner, like that. Right. He had helped him write that. Is that something that you acknowledge, or is that something that is spoken of in any kind of real way, or is that a rumor?
Yes. No, that's true. So it's not exactly so parts of the Book of Shadows that Gardner has. Well, first of all, it's still around. There's a collector who has it. There's a documentary you can watch about that Book of Shadows. Really interesting. Me and a local, Inner Circle Temple, Brian Morrow is the high priest over there. We got together. He's also a brother in the O.T.O. We got together once and did a class on Gardner and Crowley's connections to him. Gardner was a member of Ordo Templi Orientis, so he therefore later on was given a couple charters by Crowley to do initiations in O.T.O. I don't think he ever did those, but he had the charter to do it. Elements of Thelemic scripture, if you will, would end up in different parts of Gardnerian works. So, for example, but to love me is better than all things. If under the night stars in the desert thou presently burnest mine incense before me. You know that, right? That's from the Book of the Law itself. So this stuff, yeah. Crowley's influence was pretty omnipresent for lots of people. For example, in the last 20, 30 years, you've seen a Golden Dawn, a revival of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which, depending on who you talk to, is tolerant or not tolerant of Crowley or Thelema, depending, because it's like that's where he came from. On the other hand, the only reason they're still around today is because of these revivals, right, into occultism, most of which were fueled by interest in Crowley. So, if you're now into, we're gonna go and build the stuff again, and we're gonna have our own publishing house and blah blah blah, that's what O.T.O did. That's what Crowley's people were doing later on after he died in 47. So, but Gardner was a member of the O.T.O. I don't know if he was an aspirant to AA, meaning was he a magical student of Crowley's? I don't remember if we were able to determine that. But he was incorporating aspects of Thelemic doctrine into what would later become Wicca, which is why, including things like "and it harm none, do what thou wilt," and so forth and so on. So, but like I said, he also wrote something, he wrote 8 lectures on yoga, which was at its time a big deal in terms of understanding what yoga concepts and terms into Western philosophy. He also wrote a book which was like the big astrology book forever, which was not published under his name initially. Yeah. Later on, the name of which was it? I can't remember the exact name of it, but it was published a few years ago, and it's a beautiful edition. And when you realize he wrote it, it's consonant with his style. But yeah, a lot of traditions, in particular, like I said, pagan and neo-pagan traditions, have lots of stuff that relates to or was inspired by this kind of eclectic ritual work that Crowley started off with.
Okay, and you said he was initially part of the Golden Dawn, and then took that and created his own thing. Okay. So
there's a linear history there that I'll briefly tell you very quickly. Basically, So Crowley started off, so he was born in 1875. His parents were Plymouth Brethren, which is a very strict evangelical Christian sect. And so his only reading material for many, many years was the Bible. Later on, he rebelled against his Christian upbringing quite a bit and got into poetry and all sorts of other Bohemian interests in the late 19th century, one of which was a group called the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. And he became an initiate there, moved quickly up the grades, and eventually that group splintered, as occult groups have a tendency to do. And then he would leave from there and reform a lot of what he learned after receiving the Book of the Law. So in other words, rather than do something which was essentially kind of Rosicrucianism and Golden Dawn, a lot of times are basically, they have a Judeo-Christian veneer to them. That's essentially what they are. And he wanted to move beyond that, right? And you could argue that's what the Book of the Law does. It gets you, it keeps what was working in terms of mystical knowledge and from magical formulae, but discards all the dying god stuff that was holding what Crowley thought was holding the initiate back. And frees the initiate to now just, be a Gnostic initiate like they were supposed to be in the first place. Anyway, I'm sorry, go on.
Okay. So you had mentioned that he got this revelation when he was in Egypt.
Yes.
So is there a lot of Egyptian influence in Thelema?
One could argue there's a ton. Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
There's an important piece of the Thelemic movement is a sculpture, which was a funerary stele written by someone Crowley believed was his previous incarnation, the priest Ankif Nakansu, who was a priest in Thebes who wrote about the last transition of aeons, right? So the stele of revealing on it is written in Egyptian lines that later on were translated and incorporated directly into the Book of the Law, right? I am the Lord of Thebes, and I, the inspired fourth speaker of Mentu. For me unveils the veiled sky, the self-slain Nakansu, and so forth and so on. This is also if you look at it, it's a funerary stele, so it's parts of the Book of the Dead that get incorporated, therefore, through English translation into the Book of the Law.
Okay, so wait just one second. Stele, explain to everybody, because I don't know what that is.
I'm sorry.
Could you explain? Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Would you? Yeah.
Okay.
What is a stele?
A stele is something that a Egyptian would usually on wood would paint as their own kind of funeral marker for their grave. and it would be buried. If I'm not the big rich guy, but I've just got a little, funerary space for me and my mummified whatever, then that's going to be wood. Now, sometimes if they were done by, and in the case of the Stele of Revealing, the reason the Stele is important in the origin story, because when Crowley and his wife Rose were looking around at the Bulak Museum so she could tell him what God was trying to contact him, according to her, she pointed to an image of Horus known as Re Harakte, or Horus of the Two Horizons. And it's on a stele, meaning this stone version of a funerary tablet that was painted by Akif Nakansu, and it's numbered 666.
Oh.
Stele, that's new enumeration in the Bulak Museum, and it's still there in Egypt to this day, but it's called the Egyptian Museum, I believe, or the Egyptian National Museum. Anyway, so the Egyptian, as you asked before, yes, Egyptian cosmology and mysticism and magic plays a big role in the Thelemic spiritual movements, in our cosmology, all these things. So, but it's not, I wouldn't try to say that it's a Kemetic kind of thing where you have Egyptian revivalists trying to say revive something as it was absolutely supposed to be, whatever. No, it's not like that. Okay. However,
is it just an inspiration? Like it's inspired by that energy?
Yes. And I mean, at a certain point, here's what's interesting about it. It's in the holy books, and also the rest of our Libri system, the books we have. You have lots of different influences from all over the place. Okay, the Book of the Law does seem to, kind of have a lot of this direct Egyptian stuff going on, but later on you see all sorts of other stuff, usually coming in with, again, a kind of classical conception of neo-paganism and so forth and so on. But again, you've also got the other stuff. You've got angelic magic. You've got the I Ching and the Tao Te Ching. You've got the Tarot. All these things relate to the overall Thelemic system in one way or another.
It's very, very eclectic then. There's a lot of different parts to it.
Yes.
Now, so are there different traditions like you see in witchcraft where there's different traditions? Are there different sects of Thelema?
Sure, yes. Okay, so first of all, so within Thelema as a community, it's been for the last several decades dominated in terms of things that are happening within the community, largely by institutions. The biggest one is Ordo Templi Orientis. They have a big legal fight many decades ago about who controlled the copyrights of the Crowley materials. Okay, the Book of the Law and so forth and so on. Who controlled them? Who could control the OTO's trademarks themselves? This eventually resulted in the O.T.O. winning its case in the mid-'80s. And then from that point on, there was a publishing revival of all of our good texts in quality formats and so forth and so on. But there were other people who wanted their own O.T.O. Okay, they didn't believe that the leadership was the correct leadership, and so they went off and tried to have their own thing. That first split caused a schism with not a big group, but a small group of people who were sticking with, the schismatics, and they didn't win their case. So you see the kind of split up going on in that kind of mode. In other words, who gets to control the keys to the kingdom, as it were. The O.T.O. won that case and has, although the copyright history goes back and forth, up and down, the number one international Thelemic organization is still O.T.O. Now, within the AA, the magical order, that's been riven by splinter lineages fighting over who gets to claim absolute AA for quite some time. Okay.
Okay, so explain that, because a lot of the people watching don't understand what is AA and where does that differentiate?
Okay, so if the O.T.O. is a community of people working in lodge kind of situations, the way they do in Freemasonry, okay, then the AA is just a student working with just their teacher, and their work is solitary.
Solitary, and there's a mentorship going on.
Correct, and that was initially started by Crowley at the very beginning. Okay, and the Equinox, the famous magical periodical that came out in the teens, the 19-teens, right? That's where all of our stuff comes from, and that was published initially just by the AA, And later on, after the OTO accepted Thelema, then it became joint published by AA and OTO. So there was, not to get too into the weeds, but basically there was this big, long debate between people who wanted to either say that there is no such thing as AA lineages, meaning there's only one AA, and usually means the one that I think is right, or there is no rule about lineages. You can just have as many as you want, or B, the OTO can just do that stuff anyway. You don't need to do the spiritual initiation. I've took my time and did my studies. I did OTO work for many years before I started doing any kind of AA stuff, and because I wanted to make sure I was doing this as best as I could with the right way. And there is one actual AA. I know this for a fact. It's impossible to kind of prove why it is. That's a very fulfilling thing when you realize the true versus the false. Okay. But it's not, but Thelema being as individualist as it is, people go off and found all kinds of things. There was some group called the Temple of Babylon. Hey. And that was a group kind of set up as kind of a feminist domination kind of aspect of Thelema, right? Which people might say, how did you get there? I don't know. That's what they wanted to do.
That's what they wanted to do.
That's what they wanted to do. So there's lots of people out there who want to, come up with their own variation on it. And it makes sense because, hold on just a minute. My cat's doing something. Get out of there. Okay. So people, given the experimental nature of the order in the first place and Thelema as a community, it makes sense why people would want to, get in there, experiment, and do stuff. The last thing I'll say about this, lately in the last few years, a big conflict kind of arose where you have political beliefs intruding into Thelema as a community. Wow. So in other words, some people wanted to say that their political dogma was much more Thelemic than the other guy's political dogma, that kind of bullshit. Wow. That I think infiltrated everything. That wasn't just Thelema.
It's infiltrated the world at large. So yeah.
You've had a terrible case of political toxicity everywhere, and the OTO and Thelema itself as a movement got hit by that just as much as anybody else. But again, if you don't want to hang out in those kind of scenes, if you want to do work different than that, you can always find something as a Thelemite, and even find other people who you can work with on your own without, it's a pretty open kind of thing, if that makes any sense, because it's so individualized. So
is there a central hierarchy to this at all?
Well, it depends on so the OTO itself has national Grand Lodges, which are part of the International Grand Lodge. Okay, and it's run again very similar to Freemasonry. So you have the Grand Master of a country, okay, the Grand Master General. They have a Grand Treasurer General and a Grand Secretary General. So each Grand Lodge of a nation has one of those. So the United States Grand Lodge has those officers. International Grand Lodge on an international scale has the same kind of officers. So you have International Grand Master General, International Grand Treasury General, and International Grand Secretary General, and so forth. Okay, those are again those titles follow the way that their Masonic corollary works. So in other words, you have each country in the case of OTO has a Grand Lodge. So there's United States Grand Lodge, there's the Grand Lodge of the United Kingdom, there's a Grand Lodge of Croatia, Italy. I think Germany has a Grand Lodge, but anyway, the country has to have enough of a population for it to get its own Grand Lodge. Otherwise, it's still part of international. Okay. So then locally, your local city, state, or whatever, your local city, will have a camp, an oasis, or a lodge, depending on the size and functionality of your local OTO body. Las Vegas has a camp. Okay.
What is that? What would that mean? How many people would you have to have each one of those?
The requirements for these groups have changed off and on a little bit over the last, say, 25 years. Okay, so in other words, it's not so much always that it's size, meaning the population in your local group, but a lot of times functionality. So for example, a city could have a lodge that's smaller in population than somebody's oasis out in the middle of wherever. But because they say their lodge has been around for a while and has the equipment and the expertise that they can do all of the initiations of the OTO without anybody helping them, then in other words, if they met lodge requirements already, but their numbers have gone down, they can still be there. And sometimes you'll see oases get really big because one of the requirements to have a lodge versus an oasis is that a lodge has to have its own space. Okay, like there was a big move, and this is after I was I was active in leadership in OTO, then I got not so active. So after I got not so active, a big push came from Grand Lodge. Oh, we really got to get everyone's got to have their own space. Okay, instead of having it at people's houses or wherever. And it's like, well, that's a great idea, except economically difficult a lot of times. The reason that is because they thought, well, if it's done at someone's house, that person can exude influence on how things go at their house or jerky issues they might have. In other words, that makes sense, though. Yeah, and so like Masonry, if you have a lodge that everybody contributes and owns in some fashion or another, it makes it more of a neutral place. It's just economically, the OTO in large is not there yet, in my opinion. I mean, not my opinion. We don't have a lot of lodges, and nationally, you've got like a few. I mean, the lodge is the biggest one. With again, they can do the most. Okay. An oasis is a medium range, right? They can do most of the stuff that a lodge can, but just a couple other things they can't. And they don't have to have a space, although, again, they're encouraged to have a space. And then you have a camp, which can just be a few people meeting, at somebody's house.
And that's what we have here in Vegas is a camp.
Correct. You've had an oasis, you had a lodge back in the day. Groups grow, change, disasters occur, shit happens. Right. And so as a result, there's a lot of flux. For example, Las Vegas has a fairly healthily sized group of Thelemites around here comparative to other places in a city of this size. But most of them are probably not super active in like OTO necessarily. Some people are active in OTO that I haven't met yet. I mean, it's that kind of situation.
Right.
You've got older Thelemites like me. I've been around since '94. Then you've got kids now who've just come around in the late, last couple of years. Yeah. So
do you have to be an initiate to be part of this? Like, can you practice Thelema without being initiated? Or do you have to like find a local group and go through all of those steps? Can you study it on your own? Some things are, you have to follow the exact rules in a tradition, right? So is this something like that?
So again, this relates to the really eclectic nature of Thelema. For some people, Thelema is a aesthetic or ethical belief system that they've adopted, and they don't have any. And some people may have no interest whatsoever in practicing magic or jumping into some kind of weird order or doing work like that at all.
Okay.
But Thelema still is their credo. It's how they live. It informs who they are. Okay, and that's a group. That's a huge group of people out there who non-aligned Thelemites who don't care about secret society.
So it's not a religion for them. It's a life, a way to live their life of philosophy.
And it might still be a religion to them. They just don't want to deal with anyone else's crap while they're practicing it. And it's and Thelemites, given the nature of the belief system, will argue about that amongst you. Well, I don't think it's a religion. Well, I think it is. Well, I think it's a philosophy. Well, I think it's over time, I've come to realize it must be all of these things in some fashion or another because of the Thelemic credo again. But yeah, now on the other hand, if a person, and there's, this is something that became more of an interest for lots of people over the last couple decades again. If you have a hankering for actual initiation, okay, to submit your paperwork and fill your requirements and show up and go through a mysterious ritual, right, that will bring you a part of the 93rd current and say the OTO if that's your thing, then the Thelemic movement does provide this. And has been providing it pretty consistently now for a while to the community. And that's pretty cool that, OTO can do that. Even if there was no group in Las Vegas, you could travel California, Utah, Colorado. There's groups pretty close to us. And you can meet new people and you can still do actual face-to-face real initiation, which, I think for a while there had been this marketing push to get everybody just to get away from anything that had any kind of requirements to it, or
I don't know what that's all about. I noticed that too in the witchy world. People are not, they're not wanting to have to follow rules to train in the same way that I think was more found years ago, where people
Right.
were more willing to do that.
I mean, a lot of times it's just what people are into. So, for example, if everybody's into tribal belly dance and drum circles, then that's what the market's going to sell them, right? But from the 90s on to now, there was this a burgeoning online and kind of underground interest in some stuff that was really in-depth occultism. No longer the New Age stuff, not transpersonal, none of that. It's like everybody was like, okay, that's what everybody else wants to buy. But we're looking into, serious occultism. You're looking at trying to, and that's, again, from time to time that would percolate back into the mainstream. So Qabalah got big again, even though that had been percolating in the Western tradition forever. Meaning, and same thing with Tarot. So I'm kind of like, I want to be open to people and say, look, if you are a Thelemite and you just want to be a Thelemite and read the Book of the Law, knock yourself out. That's great. If, however, you are interested in certain aspects of occultism and want to learn them, okay, and see what that's like, you can actually do that in O.T.O. Okay. It's not for everybody, and I wouldn't say that, but again, there was an interest over the last couple decades, like I said, of people saying, you know what, I've done the superficial stuff. I really want a real experience. I really want to see what happens if I actually go through a real initiation.
Right. So what's the ultimate goal of the Thelemite? What is it that, are you looking for enlightenment, power, control, salvation? What is it that you're talking about diving deeper, getting deeper into occultism? What is it that the goal is here?
Well, so Thelema, generally, if you look at what its basic descriptions are in the founding documents we have, Thelema is concerned about the individual figuring out what their will is and doing it. Okay.
Okay. So what is the will?
Right.
People don't know. What does that mean?
That means, for whatever reason you're put here, whatever your function is, whatever your special purpose might be in this universe, figuring that out, which is also going to tell you who you are as a person, and then living your life according to who that person is and what your will is going to be. Okay. Now, the way this, again, I'm being very superficial, but if everyone's doing their own will, doing their own thing, the idea is that we're not supposed to be clashing with each other because we're not trying to control each other's behavior anymore. Okay. And there's now the mystical, magical side of this comes in when one goes into the idea of, well, how do we determine, who you are and what your will is? How does one take the journey inward, which is what initiation literally means, to traveling inwards? How do you do that to determine these things? And how do you do that in a way that's freed from, old Aeon initiation, which was not concerned about the human individual, but was concerned about you as part of, group, tribe, gender, whatever,
Yeah.
Okay, so Thelema. So now you asked about, is this about power, control?
Yeah. What's it about? Yeah.
Those are all things connected to what, discovering and doing your true will at the end of the day. Those are, and it's extremely personal as a pursuit of who you are and what you're going to be doing. And some people might do that and initiate into all sorts of traditions, and some people may not. They may just say, this is my will and I'm going to do it. And I'm going to try to, live my life as reflecting, what my will is and who I am. And that's why it can be a very materialistic ethical system where we don't believe in supernatural powers and just look at everything as metaphor. Or you can expand our understanding of consciousness to a place where it's like, well, okay, these mystical, magical experiences are true, but I have to understand them in the context of who I am individually. It works either way. That's, and again, it's because it's based on that primary understanding of do what thou wilt.
And it's really truly finding a true connection to self and the soul's journey in this lifetime.
Correct.
Right? Okay.
Yeah.
Wow. I honestly didn't know that. That's pretty cool. Yeah, that's awesome. I heard you use a term in your bio, and I was reading it, you said something about the great work.
Yes.
What is that? What does that mean? What's that all about? What is the great work?
The great work is a term that we find in alchemy. And the great work is generally described metaphorically as doing, well, what? Changing lead to gold. This transformation is also can be seen as a philosophical metaphor for our understanding ourselves. For understanding ourselves from the most heavy dross, thick version of ourselves, the lead, right, to a transformative process where we go from that to achieving the gold aspect of ourselves, where we're unified with our true self, with, some people might say the holy guardian angel. Or if you want to be more blunt, God. How are we when we get in communication with our own Godhead? When we go from being average, flawed person to spiritual enlightened being.
Like nirvana.
Kind of. Nirvana has a technical place above the abyss. Okay, now.
Okay.
Sorry, but right now we are dealing with the transformation of the kind of like regular human being without spiritual awareness to the hyperconscious being who's enlightened and knows themselves, right? And the thing I've learned about this is that it's not, at least again, this is just Terry's opinion. This is not static. This is always going on. The universe is doing this all the time. We're doing this all the time. Okay, sometimes we may or may not hit places that are big events in our magical career where we achieve a certain kind of state of consciousness and get a certain kind of title or grade or initiation or whatever, right? That's different. But the work that's always that alchemical process of the great work is always going on.
Okay. All right. You mentioned the abyss.
Yes.
What is this concept?
Okay, so
it's something about the AA and the abyss, and I don't know what that is.
So do you know the tree of life?
Yes.
Okay. So the tree of life in the Hebrew system, as we get it through the Western mystery tradition, where it's been very much westernized. So it starts off as the purely Jewish Qabalah and then comes over to us westernized. So I can use it to understand anything. I can use it to understand yoga states of consciousness. I can use it to understand pagan gods and goddesses, right? Mm-hmm. That they all fit in there someplace. Well, the abyss is a doctrine that comes to us largely through the Thelemic Qabalah, the understanding of the tree of life and the Qabalah through Crowley's Thelemic revelation. Because these concepts, although you could argue they were out there before, this is the place where we really find them solidified as magical ideas. So basically you've got 10 spheres of the tree of life going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. From the most spiritual, Keter, to the most material, Malkut, meaning from the crown, Keter, Malkut, kingdom. Okay. The abyss are the top, is a level, a layer of dimensionality that separates the top 3 spheres from everything below that. And for the magician of the AA to attain to being a master of the temple or magister templi, they have to cross this abyss between the phenomenal world, which is here, right, and the numinal plane, which is completely transcendent. This usually involves, it seems, if you read the descriptions, to involve very much a shredding of the ego, the destruction, and it can lead to psychological breaks. It's not just like in yoga; it's a heavy place of consciousness to attain, and can cause you all kinds of problems if you're not ready. Okay, but once you cross, or this state of being, one then becomes a master of the temple, and is then basically, and at that point you now are part of the AA, both in its physical college and its spiritual manifestation. That's weird as a metaphor, hard to understand, but you get the idea. But basically the abyss is that place between real and actual, right? Between conscious and apparently some kind of hyper consciousness or unconsciousness. And it's just, there's states in Buddhism and Hinduism that achieve the same thing, where the ego is annihilated, right? To attain higher magical states. And that's what happens when you cross the abyss. That's the language Crowley was using, was crossing the abyss to attain those states.
Okay.
Sorry.
Oh, am I getting feedback here? Why is that happening? Oh, no, it's gone now. All right. So a good explanation. I'm learning so much. I hope everybody else is. Like, this is so fascinating to me. I love it. Terry,
And, we got into the heavy stuff first. I don't know how we did that. We're not even.
I don't know how we did it either, but that's okay. I always like to go with the flow. Go with the flow. Sure. So, what energies do you work with in Thelema? Like, is it gods, goddesses, angels, devils? I mean, I don't know, demons. Yeah, all of it.
All of them, because, for example, you have, and this is stuff that we inherit from the Western mystery tradition, right? So you have the Goetia, which is the lesser key of Solomon, generally considered demons. Yes. I consider them to be just low frequency. It's like, you don't have to call them demons. Don't hold it against them that they're low frequency. Okay, we call them earth spirits in most traditions, but no, we got to call them demons. Okay, but then you have the greater key of Solomon dealing with God names and angelic names and archangelic names, and it's that, in other words, one kind of deals with stuff in a planetary, one kind of in a earth-based realm, but they're both part and parcel of the same system that the Qabalah enables you to access. And then the Thelemic Qabalah, then interprets it all according to that doctrine. So it's the good and the bad aspects of what we call, white magic, black magic, these are all Christian interpretations of stuff. And so it's annoying, frankly, to see them brought up at any point in pagan circles or neo-pagan circles. I can't tell people what to believe and not to get rid of these systems of thinking. It's colonized thought, frankly. It's where you're sitting there and you're holding your own beliefs against you. Look, nobody's saying we need to go put everybody burning in a big wicker man again, right? No one's saying you need to go play soccer with your heads in Aztec land. We don't need to go back all that way, but we can admit to what was right about our integration to the natural world. Right? We can say that, nature spirits were a way of us understanding our own relationship to the natural world, and that it's not so bad that they exist. It's not such a terrible thing that, we have to, paganism has to be completely thrown out because it was so politically gross and incorrect and such. No, it's part of who we are. So Thelema allows us, I like to think, the ability to be honest and look into that stuff that way. So, for example, there are rituals. Magic, there's a shitload of rituals in Thelema, some of which allow you to do adorations of different solar gods at each station of the sun. Okay. That has a lot of different benefits that I don't want to get too much into. It's an AA ritual, although it's about as close to a big public ritual the AA has. It's called Liber Resh. Okay. And Liber Resh, by the way, Resh is a Hebrew letter that corresponds to the sun card in the Tarot.
Yeah. Wow.
Okay. And in that ritual, you do an adoration to 4 solar gods, Ra, Ahathor, Tum, and Kefra. And you do that 4 times a day. Okay. That's a case of a general invocation ritual that's Thelemic practice. There's banishing rituals with the pentagrams and hexagrams that people would see in other traditions. There's specific Thelemic rituals that do crazy ass stuff based on our Thelemic cosmology, right? Usually being basically heliocentric versus geocentric, right?
Okay.
Ritual, including even when you look at, say, most everybody's rituals, including Wicca, including Freemasonry, they're geocentric. The sun is at the center of the solar system and we're going around it, right? Thelemic rituals, well, not all the time, but a lot of times the candidate, the magician, is the sun. Okay. Oh, wow. And that changes things in perspective in what terms of why you do things. So depending what the Thelemite interest is interested in, they might work with all kinds of different energies, right? So for example, someone might decide, I want to just be very ascetic with my practice and stick with the yoga side, which is completely doable. And in that case, the energies you're working with are the same, or trying to work through the stages of consciousness one goes through in yoga practice. Okay. Raja yoga in particular. That's not the only one, but so it just depends on what the individual Thelemite wants to work on. And some Thelemites might work on all kinds of stuff that may not strictly be considered Thelemic doctrine per se. I know lots of Thelemites who are both Wicca, Neo-Pagan, Freemason. They initiated into Golden. But lots of people I know have done that kind of stuff.
Right.
But
so when you're talking about angels and demons and the gods and goddesses, they all take on a unique flavor, let's call it, when you're dealing with it in this practice. It's not the angels and demons in Judeo-Christian religion. It is not even the Egyptian gods and goddesses in the same way that a Kemetic Reconstructionist would do it. It's very, very unique to this practice.
Yes,
right?
and no, yes and no. The
Okay.
Kemetic's going to be established in Egyptology the same way we are.
Okay.
Okay, so they're going to work with They're going to work with the Book of the Dead. Guess what is in our stuff? The Book of the Dead. So I mean, there's things about it that are going to be, like, for example, the Rites of Eleusis was this beautiful series of rituals Crowley wrote to be performed as kind of a. It was initially performed in London as sort of a fundraiser, and it was done by the AA, which is funny because the AA is not supposed to do public rituals or group rituals. Anyway, but each of the rituals of the Rites of Eleusis corresponds to one of the classical planets and has all these great classical pagan Greco-Roman Easter eggs. Okay, if you've got a classical education, or if you're familiar with these gods or god, you're going to know them. You're going to say, oh yeah, those are the torchbearers, or that's Jupiter, or that's Ganymede, or what have you. Okay, there's a lot of stuff like that we have. So in other words, if you want to say that the Thelemite looking at these things might be looking at them differently than everybody else does, sure, of course they are. But then again,
right.
so's everybody.
Right, got it. So in Thelema, there is a practice of magic. Do all of them practice magic? And do they consider themselves witches?
Some Thelemites are witches.
Okay.
There's a fan of Wicca, which I always encourage them, if they can, to dig back into the Gardner stuff as much as possible. Dory Valiente is the one who changed the Crowley and tried to mess around with it. So I'm like, okay, I get why you did that. It ain't cool to do that. These are holy books. We don't change them. We're not supposed to change them.
Right.
But anyway, but it's okay. It's not my ritual. It's not my group. There's people who, some Thelemites will do daily ritual practices of all kinds. Some people will do nothing. Okay. Some people will be following a magical set of practices from a set of instructions. Maybe it's something they got from O.T.O. Maybe they're an AA aspirant and they're following oaths and tasks of their grade and the instructions from their superior. Maybe they're a member of the Gnostic Catholic Church and they're working on something as a deacon or a priest and priestess.
Okay.
So they could be. Just a minute. I'm sorry. Just a minute, please.
Sure.
Bear with me for one moment.
Sure.
Sorry about that.
Oh, it's okay.
It's okay. Almost had a big interruption. And my cat also. But anyway, so a lot of excuse, my cat's trying to fuck up my leg. Okay, so what were we saying again? I completely got my train of thought.
We were talking about considering if they practice magic, do they consider themselves witches? You were talking about rituals and things they do daily.
Right. So we've run into this before, where you've got some people who are Thelemites who do not consider themselves even pagans, which is fine if that's what you want to. Who cares? It's your opinion. Or they don't want to be considered witches. Some people came to Thelema from a Wiccan or witchcraft background, and so that's still part of who they are. There's multiple. There's a umbrella in Thelema for that. So that's kind of what you said. You don't. There's not a uniformity to that. There's no one thing everybody's supposed to do. From time to time, what you'll see is people get a misconception, like they think, okay, well, if I'm an O.T.O person, I've got to do X, Y. No, not really. What's the requirement for your next degree in O.T.O? That's what you got to do. The Magic's over here in AA, for example, or if you want to do it personally. On your own, that's what people saying, well, I got to do this something every day, or that. Nah, I mean, it's up to you if you want to, but there's no requirement on that.
No requirement for that.
Not unless you're in a specific form of instruction for some reason.
All right, so I have a big question for you. Aleister Crowley has quite a reputation, let's say, with, in the world. And there's a lot of negativity that's kind of been assigned to, Crowley himself and his religion. And, insinuations of Satanism, devil worship. These are mostly people who don't understand what it is.
Right.
But do you feel like that's something that is less now or more now? Or do you find any kind of stigma attached to this path that you're on?
That's a good question. Yes and no. In other words, the demon Crowley, as we say, is still very much there. It still colors people's opinions of what O.T.O, what Thelema is about, what the Thelemic movement's trying to do. And the sensational aspect of him, it's never really completely ever gone away. You can still, if you can go online and watch innumerable documentaries, still approaching the same subjects from the same sensationalist background every single time. Yeah. If there's a few years ago, there were biographies that were finally released, and not just the one Crowley wrote called The Autobiography of Aleister Crowley. There was some other ones that were finally issued by good scholars with good access to good material. They were interesting, well done. It still doesn't satiate the desire for people for sensational stuff about this story.
Right.
I think, frankly, the movement will go on and Crowley will stay the same, haunting us forever, because he's such a strong personality. He broke a lot of barriers at a time when you didn't see the celebrity culture things that it did. So it's just not going to go away anytime soon. Okay, so in Thelemic circles, when you talk to magicians or people who've been seeing this stuff, it's almost like there's several different barriers you put up with in terms of your work and study. So you've got the generic New Age world. Again, most people don't know what you're into, have no clue about it, don't care, or if they do know it, weirds them out, they're scared. Okay. You get to neo-paganism, witchcraft, and so forth and so on. Some people know something about it. Again, good portion do not. It's not their path. They don't care. And guess what? Still probably have a negative opinion coming into this, which and everybody can believe what they want, except those are usually old residual Christian hang-ups still bugging everybody. Sorry. I mean, if you want to just be honest about these things, it's like, we all know. Then you have the community that Crowley himself came from, which is interesting and a very niche kind of community, and that's within the Western tradition itself: Freemasonry, Rosicrucianism, Hermeticism, that kind of thing. Okay, which there's serious scholarship and serious research that's been done by a long list of people for a long time, and he comes in and disturbs the whole apple cart and comes up with this Thelema thing. Okay, which instead of trying to continue to Christianize things, which is what the Rosicrucian movements were and Masonry were doing. He says, no, I'm going to chuck that. We're done. What? Yeah, we're going to chuck that. And I'm going to embrace all this 20th century modernist stuff. Like, in other words, he was embracing the fact that philosophy had lost its way to modernists, right? In other words, philosophy was no longer able to count on permanent institutions anymore. You have postmodernism kick in the 20th century, which just means what are we believing in? What are we following? Is God dead, as Nietzsche said? And Crowley's answer was, there is no law beyond do what thou wilt. And so that message then resonates and creates this big movement. But within, like I said, within the conservative circles of the Western mystery tradition, initially horror, and they didn't like him. They didn't want him to be part of this. The Golden Dawn obviously didn't want him to be around. Freemasonry was not going to see him as some big savior, even though he thought he was. It wasn't going to work until decades later. And then pretty much later on, you see other, these old groups like the Golden Dawn and so forth coming back. Why? Because people are interested in these esoteric topics again, like from Aleister Crowley.
Right. So what do you think? What do you think the biggest contribution to modern magical practice that Thelema has brought to the table? What do you think is like the biggest contribution to this whole, the whole community at large?
I would probably I'd probably say actually the biggest thing it's brought to everybody, not just the Western tradition, but also all the neo-pagans, has been the eclecticism of our movement in the first place.
Yeah,
okay.
All right.
The idea of people saying, I'm going to just redo a pagan ritual in my backyard.
Right.
Me and my friends are going to make some robes and we're just going to do it, which, we're going to do midsummer and we're going to say hello to the gods and goddess. I mean, the fact that people do that in the first place owes a lot to people like Crowley, who were founding O.T.O and doing that AA work back in the early 20th century. And basically because they had this attitude that you could just do this. You didn't have to necessarily, because remember, Golden Dawn, as cool as it was very much upper middle class kind of stuff. And everybody, all the bohemians getting into it that was not going to be happening anytime soon, although it took members, but it was still very much part and parcel of the British establishment. What Crowley did with Thelema was, opened it up for everybody. Okay, and he wasn't the only one doing this. So later on, you'd have people who's like, well, I'm not going to jump up and down and be a Thelemite, but say Gerald Gardner is going to start his own coven, right? And he knows you can do something like that and have it work. So.
Right. Wow. You know what? That's quite a contribution, honestly. That's a huge contribution. Absolutely. You gave people freedom. He gave people freedom to be able to explore and to maybe reach out to the universe in a way that they might have been afraid to or weren't able to. That's amazing to me. So let's say somebody's listening right now and they're like, wow, this is really interesting. I feel something, I'm connected. What should they do? How should they go out and find more information? Is there somewhere they should go look? Is there a book? Is there a website?
Okay. This is what I would always tell people before I would sponsor them to be initiated to be a Minerval, the first initiation in the O.T.O. The first thing I would say is, before you think about doing any of this, read the Book of the Law. Read the whole thing. It's 220 verses. It's 3 chapters. It's very short. It can be read more or less in one sitting. And either that book is going to magically connect with you or it won't. That's it.
Okay.
We can have all sorts of esoteric, as you said, looky-loo kind of interests in these sort of things, and that's great. But participatory interests, wanting to become a part of the third current, accepting the Book of the Law, this is stuff that has to be done by the individual. They have to do this for themselves, and the first thing they need to do, in my opinion, is just read the Book of the Law.
Okay.
There's a lot of people later on who are going to want to interpret it for you. There's lots of other holy books. There's lots of other instructional things going out there, all kinds of stuff. But that book is the basis of the whole Thelemic movement. And and when people read it, that's what begins the process. And that's the first thing I would advise anybody to do.
All right, Book of the Law. Anybody watching, take a look at it, and then you'll know what to do after that. Keep seeking and you'll find it. That's what I think.
Right.
All right. So thank you so much, Terrence, for being here. This was really enlightening for me. I hope everybody watching enjoyed this as much as I did, because this was great. Our next episode is next weekend on Sunday, May 15th, and we're going to talk with some of the members of the Seattle Psychics Association. Also, some big news starting in June. We're not going to just be doing a Sunday show. We are going to have themed days of the week. And so far, I have booked Witch Talk Wednesdays, all booked in June, and Psychic Saturdays. And we're going to have some of the best psychics that I know on the show, mediums, and we'll have them come on and talk to everybody. And we will continue doing our Sunday Touch of Magics, and I'll be adding some others in. So I'm really excited. Until then, remember to be the magic, because you are the magic, and that is a fact. And I'll see you next time. Thanks, Terrence.